Hey guys, thanks for coming out to our talk, Money, Sec, Evolved, wherein not everything has a tidy baseball analogy. This is kind of a riff off of the book Moneyball, and we did a presentation on this last year at a couple of venues. So this is the sequel. So my name is Brian Keefer. I'm a security architect with a leading SaaS security vendor, and this is Jared Pfost.
Hello. And I build tools to help manage security teams.
So just a quick word to the audience, if you guys can help me look out for Chris Nickerson. He said that he was going to wad up and throw dollar bills at me, which is fine, seeing as the gas prices have gone up 50 cents in the last 2 weeks. So I could use the spending money, but just give me a heads up if he comes in here and starts winding up.
We'll take 20s.
And here's our requisite cat picture. We were told that we had to have a cat picture, and since this is baseball themed, we figured we would go with this cute little guy.
All right. My hands are washed.
He hates me for putting that in there. So recap from last year, we applied baseball sabermetrics to information security. So this was our talk from last year. And then we spent some time out in the real world. I went and tried to implement some things in our organization, and Jared went and worked with some mature organizations. And then, oh yeah, some guy named Brad was in some movie, and I heard somebody actually mention that already today, that I must have had that like a dozen times last summer.
Yeah.
No, it's not from the movie, it's from the book. So in case you missed it, this is how analytics changed the sport of baseball. So the case study from the book, Moneyball, is the Oakland A's. And in baseball, if you're not familiar with how it works this way in most sports. So you pick your sport. Teams bid in a free agent market for talent. They bid for players. And the goal is obviously the better a player performs, supposedly, the more they're worth. They ask for more money. And so it's a competitive market. At the start of the 2002 season, the Oakland A's had a payroll of about $40 million for the year. Conversely, the New York Yankees, who were one of their big rivals at the time, also the richest team in baseball, had about $126 million to spend. So the budget there was asymmetric, and so you would think that from this, poor teams have no shot at winning. But if we actually look at the data, we break this down, and this is what the book Moneyball did. You can see over this 3-year period that the New York Yankees had 280 wins, which is a lot of wins. That's how baseball success is measured in wins. But then you look and you see the Oakland A's also had 280 wins. And you look and see what their payroll was. So I calculated this, excluding bonuses and some other things. But it's about $257 million spent over that period by the New York Yankees, and about $70 million spent by the A's. So you have less than 30% basically right there is being spent by the A's, and yet they get the same results. So why did this happen? And this is why it's a really interesting case study, and why a book was written about this, is most of this success is attributed to the general manager, Billy Beane. But how did he manage to have this success? Well, for one thing, he didn't follow best practices. So he didn't go out and do what every other baseball team did, because he figured, well, if I have, X, and everybody else that I'm competing with has 3X, and I do the same thing that they're doing, how am I going to get better results? That doesn't make sense. So he made data-driven decisions. He hired analysts and mathematicians. One of these people was Paul D. Podesta, who was actually an economist from Harvard. So in traditional baseball, talent is evaluated. So this is what all the other teams do or did. Traditional baseball, talent is evaluated by scouts. So scouts are players who either didn't make it to the big leagues, they weren't successful players, or they got injured, something happened. But they kind of been around baseball for a long time. They were sort of industry experts because they kind of knew a lot about baseball. They've been to a lot of baseball games, and people thought, well, if you spend that much time around something, you must know something about it. And the value statements from scouts are largely subjective. So they say some guy, looks really smooth in his delivery or really crushes the ball. But these are highly subjective statements. So in contrast, next generation baseball, what I call next gen baseball, although in retrospect that's kind of a poor choice because you go over to RSA and there's next gen everything over there and it's just the same stuff. Started in 1977, a guy named Bill James wanted to see what really influenced the outcome of games and what over the course of a baseball season led to successful teams versus not successful teams. And he realized that the stats, when he started trying to analyze this, he realized that the stats that were collected had been created in 1859. That's not a typo, 1859. And they had come over from cricket, which was a completely different game. And so the stats really didn't attribute the events that were happening on the field. So there really wasn't a way to analyze the data that was available and tell what created success. So the key lessons from the book, I'm just summarizing here. We did a whole presentation on this. If you're interested, I still have the slides online from that. You can contact me and you can go and look at the slides from the original presentation. But the key takeaways here from the Moneyball philosophy is don't make emotional decisions. So when you go out and if you're too close to something, you're going to be making emotional decisions. They're based on a small sample set, and they're just, how were you feeling that day and how was this person performing that day? And if you're making a decision based on that, it's not likely to be accurate. You also need to collect the right data. So you need to have data that's actually representative of what's going on. And once you've collected that data, then you can look for correlations in the data. And the other key point is set a reasonable criteria for success. So one of the things that the Oakland A's did that was different from all the other teams' approach at the time was that they figured out how many wins they would need to have per season in order to go to the playoffs, because their goal was to go to the playoffs. And then they only spent as much as they had to get to that number of wins, how they projected out that they would win that many games. They didn't overspend. So our premise here is that this applies to information security. So the problem statement is that every organization is competing with attackers, right? Every company out there, every nonprofit, anyone who has any kind of digital presence is competing with attackers. And the problem for everybody who's not in the Fortune 50 is we don't have gigantic security budgets. So how can we be effective with limited budgets? So the conventional wisdom, so let's look at some information security conventional wisdom, right? So everybody knows that you need to have a firewall, right? And you need to have antivirus, and you need to change your passwords frequently, and you've got to block that social networking. No Facebook, no Twitter while you're at work. That's all bad, right? You've heard all these things. These are information security best practices. But if we're a little bit critical, we start looking at these. We look at, wait a second. Port 80 web traffic goes right through a firewall. You do ACL, allow, 80, any. Antivirus misses custom malware. Anybody can go download Metasploit, go through an encoder, and their payload is going to fly right through antivirus. Stolen passwords are used really quickly. People don't sit on them for a long time to use them, and social networking is a key to marketing in current companies and also employee satisfaction. So this is a problem. So maybe we should take a different approach to this. And before we even start to say that is, do we actually want to take a new strategy? Management want a new strategy? Are we on board with taking a new approach? And then, if we're going to do that, what does winning actually look like? So in baseball, it's pretty clear. We have wins and we have 9-inning games, and we can figure out who's the winner and loser at the end. But how do we get started? What does winning look like? We need to figure that out first. And then once we've got that settled, then how do we get started?
All right. Thanks, Brian. Time to roll up our sleeves, and thanks for joining me in the Jumpy House here today. It's great. So before we can get into how do we determine and build a data-driven security program, I want to answer those questions that Brian talked about. And the first one is, are we really ready to win? And in this spectrum, every organization that I've been with over 17 years or so fits on this spectrum, where on the left, you're building up your security debt. Then there's this motivating event, whether it's an incident or a nasty audit or a leadership change. The next event is where you have all the backing, and there's more time and resources than you can possibly execute on. Then the next year when you come back, you want more resources. This phase, that's where management says, all right, how much do you really need? So the key takeaway here is recognize where you sit on this spectrum to determine how aggressive you should be in building a data-driven program that we're going to go through. And so the second question that Brian asked, well, what does winning look like then? So, I don't know if I'm sure everybody saw MoneySec version 1.0. Right. The premise was very clear. It was, what are candidate metrics that directly correlate to reducing incidents? It's very clear. It's going to be outcome driven. And we don't have the luxury of 9 innings and the highest score wins. So what does winning look like to us? So we took a different approach and said, sometimes winning for InfoSec is not losing. where that's defined as having no unacceptable risk being realized. And by the way, you live like a cost center, you have to do this on the cheap. So forgive the image there, but we said, if it feels like you're pulling teeth, you're fighting for time and money, that's what's needed for a data-driven security program. You want to take this?
Yeah, so about that. So we did the 1.0 version. We had these 12 metrics, these 12 candidate metrics that we said, oh, these are a good idea to track. And I was all fired up, and I thought, oh, yeah, this will be a piece of cake. Everybody's been doing it wrong. I'm going to go implement this stuff, and it's going to solve all the problems. So I started collecting information in the organization that I work at, and what I really quickly realized was that the information that I had available was far from complete. So I was trying to get a visibility across the whole organization and try to measure things, and I just didn't have the data available in a lot of the areas that I wanted to look at that. And then the other aspect of that was that if I wanted to measure if we changed some control, does the outcome change? Well, then when we started going and looking at our incident data to figure out, well, what's our historical outcomes been in security, and so then we can compare it to the future, we just didn't have the incident data. IT hadn't been collecting it. They had just been going and reformatting laptops, so we had no idea what the historical incidents were like. So we didn't really have that ability to measure what was helping in my organization.
Cool. So given that reality, we're now 1 year smarter. And so clip art tells us that, hey, maybe we need to take a crawl, walk, run approach to this thing. And this is what really represents how this talk is organized now. So we've cherry-picked those original MoneySec metrics and find the ones that are the easiest to collect. How to pilot the process of establishing a target and measuring actuals against it, and using that to demonstrate value so you can get more time and resources, you can undercover more rocks, get more data. And then that third aspect, here's our little run icon. Once we have some history, now how do we optimize those targets? Are we spending too much or too little based off our historic data? So let's get going. Starting with the easy, and easy in quotes. I mean, even Brian's anecdote is very relevant. And it starts off with our first area is you have to be able to mine the data that you have. I'm still amazed to the different organizations I work with, they don't take advantage of all the gold that they're sitting on top of. It starts with the incident data in two classifications. One is from a business impact standpoint, as you see here, of incidents that hit executive management, middle management, and even all those things that maybe just stop at the help desk. Quantify those occurrences. You'll need that data in the future. And the second aspect of incident categorization then is from the threat action type. So take the Verus approach in the Verizon database breach report. Understand what's occurring in your environment from a technical standpoint as well as an impact. And now once we have that baseline of information, we can start tracking progress against it. So our first MoneySec metric was around applications. So if you do in-house development, what is the easiest way, the very first one to track progress? And it doesn't get much easier than production application vulns. So either an incident's going to find them, or hopefully your assessment team is going to find them, and it's a great revelation. So now you've demonstrated the complexity of exploiting that vulnerability. You just need to complete the risk statement for what is the asset, the action, the agent, and the impact of this. You've got a well-formed risk statement. You're ready to affect change in the organization. Especially with targets of how often should these occur. Now in the passwords area, this one really needs to come with a bit of an asterisk. So it really has to pass the so what test. So if you're concerned about consumer creds, or front office or back office creds, make sure that when you measure this area, that it relates to something that's important. Take the Verizon DBR. I think of the top threat actions, number 4 was default and blank passwords. Number 7 was, let me guess, pun intended, easily guessed and brute force passwords. So again, this is something that the security team can control. It's an easy to audit. You don't have to rely on somebody to go get this information. Just make sure that that story resonates with management. And my favorite in the easy category is scanned vulnerabilities. And we're starting to see more of this. So as at MetroCon yesterday, And the Department of State, with their continuous monitoring process, they've caught on that, hey, here's something that we can automate and track over time and segregate and show performance. They need to take it a couple steps further, but it's wonderful progress. So I'm not just interested in the counts of vulnerabilities that identify. Let's take it another step further and show how old are those vulnerabilities based off severity and the assets they're associated with. And we'll get into that a bit more. So I keep talking about targets, and I want to get something, a solid foundation laid right away. So how many here have at least just one metric in their organization? Maybe a quarter. So of those who measure, how many have a defined target that you compare your actuals against? Nobody.
Told you.
You told me. So in my humble opinion, a metric without a target is a waste of time. For two reasons. By defining what this target is, that process is driving acceptable risk. That target is defined by the security group and the control owner or the business owner, depending on the metric. Where do we expect to be for those 4 metrics that I just talked about and the 8 that we're going to cover? By negotiating through what that expectation should be, you're really implicitly defining what is acceptable risk for this control area. And the second benefit of having a target is it simplifies reporting. It gives you the eye candy. So take this little rainbow chart here. I even took the labels off. And we can just see, okay, for this first 6 months, we've been performing above expectations. Something happened, we were below, we got back up. Doesn't matter what it is, but there's a story there to communicate what happened. And that visual helps communicate that story because we just care, are we performing above or below that target?
Yeah. And that kind of riffs off of what Martin was saying in the other track, is that, trying to go for 100% secure, totally secure, is just a fallacy. That's a flawed assumption. And I think that's what this illustrates.
Cool. It's very, very powerful. All right, so back to the easy. I wanted to expand on the scan vulnerabilities a bit. So as I described, what we're talking about here isn't just counts of vulns, but what's the time to live? How long are they on your environment? And being able to set policy based on the severity and the environment. So here we just have a histogram of, we have so many vulns and how old they are, but it really changes the conversation when you're able to talk with your business owners and say, hey, let's understand this. Why are these vulnerabilities over this asset class past the pre-negotiated SLA by our operations team? So the goal here is to take the emotion out of it and just have a data-driven conversation. These vulns, is there a process breakdown? Was there a testing glitch? Do we just suck? What's the underlying issue? And why are we not operating at acceptable risks that we agreed on? Maybe we need to change the target. It doesn't matter what the answer is. What matters is that's a data-driven conversation.
Right, and just in case you guys didn't catch it here on this slide, because I didn't even catch it the first time, what this is illustrating right here is the vulnerabilities that are present that weren't accepted. So these are what we've measured that is beyond our risk tolerance. Right. It's over the target that we set.
Cool. And we've got an example here, right?
Right, so this is actually an example of making this very simple. One of the things that I've noticed is that a couple of the metrics presentations, and they're all good. There was one by Mike Lloyd yesterday, I think it was. It had an attack map, which looked great. And then it had a whole bunch of math, and I don't know about any of you, but I'm not really that great with math. And so I was like, man, okay, I can see how that was done, but I don't know how I would go and do that with the data that I have. So I just did something really simple that's like the training wheels version of metrics to illustrate this.
Yeah, just to iterate, you don't need fancy tools. And what's this, some Excel knockoff?
Yeah, this is the Mac spreadsheet program, the OS 10 spreadsheet program. So I don't know if you can read that, but basically what I'm doing here is just pulling in available information that I have. I'll try to walk about here, and the camera guys are going to go nuts. So here I'm just tracking how many servers are in my environment over a period of time. So hopefully you all have inventory. If you don't have an inventory of your assets, you have to start there. Sorry, it sucks, it's hard, but you have to start there. Then we're going with scan vulnerabilities, medium or high severity, user devices. Again, this is from your inventory. How many missing patches on your user devices. And this goes back to what Ron Gula was talking about earlier of doing authenticated scans. You kind of breeze past that. I don't know if you caught what that means, but when you're using a vulnerability assessment tool, you have the ability to plug in credentials to the vulnerability assessment tools that actually can log into the operating system and query what patches are installed on that system, so then it can do the delta and figure out which ones are missing. Very important. And then terminations, how many of your terminations happen within the time window that you had agreed on for your process. And so then from here, we just start doing some ratios. So the number of high severity vulnerabilities divided by the number of servers in the environment. That gives you how many high severity vulnerabilities per server that you have deployed. It's fairly simple math. You can do this in a spreadsheet. You don't even need the function wizard to do that. And then we extend that out to all of our different things that we're tracking here. So we can do it for terminations, we can do it for devices, etc. And then, so this is the important part, this is the leap, is that we try to figure out, and at first this is just kind of a subject matter expert estimation, but we try to figure out with our current resources, with the current budget that we're putting into this, with the current technology, with the current people we have, what do we think is a reasonable level for each of these things? So how many missing high severity vulnerabilities do we think is reasonable that we can achieve with our current resources? And then we'll just put that as a target. So we set that target for each of these categories, and this drives the discussion, like Jared was talking about. This drives the discussion with the business units of how much risk are they willing to tolerate, and what are they going to accept. And then we can draw shiny pictures with this. So graph it. This isn't really that hard. There's a graph function in your spreadsheet. I've never been to spreadsheet training in my life, obviously. But this is your target right here. So this line is your target, and then you can see your actual measured performance against that target. And once you have the information available to collect from, doing this very simple analysis is really not that hard.
And just to add on, don't underestimate the power of this very basic visual. And if somebody's ever said, hey, what do you guys do? This demonstrates that it doesn't matter what the numbers are, but it demonstrates that you're working with the operations team or the control owner here. You've negotiated what this control is. You're verifying actual performance, and you're determining, is that acceptable based off the business objective? I mean, wow, it's little simple visual, communicates a lot. All right, ready to jump into some of the rest of the money sack metrics?
You're excited.
Yeah, okay. So the goal here again is easy to find data, and you can control that process. And we wanted to cover as much of the spread as we could and relate that to reducing incidents. So the first category, access management. So this is kind of a clever one. Percentage of employees terminated within policy. So the data to go get is, depending on your HR system, when the employee tells the manager they're leaving, and then where the manager tells HR and the HR system and the creds are lost. So those deltas are great data points. I'd say, yep, every large organization that I've been with, I was really surprised of how long it took. The process failure was when usually the manager telling HR that somebody had left, and I may or may not have been part of that problem. It's a really good metric to get insight into the process. Related is percent role access verification. So this doesn't even comment about how effective those roles are, just that for some percentage of your user base, somebody is going through the process and verifying that role. And that is a great early indicator. And it could be 5%, but is that the right amount, and is that being executed on consistently? On the network side, this is fully understand, probably oversimplified. Percent critical systems monitored. We let the standard talk about what events are we going to monitor and what is the workflow behind them. But the goal here is to communicate coverage and how much coverage do we think we should have, and are we executing on that? A really cool thing that I'm seeing is moving this to full packet capture inspection. So, for example, some organizations are taking key ingress and egress points, looking for protocol anomalies or egress communication, and using that as a proof of concept to justify expanding this. So they're using this target-based metric now of saying, we think we need to get to 10%, 20%, 30%, as they demonstrate value, that they're actually reducing the length and the extent of incidents. On the vendor side, if you leverage a lot of service providers, here's a good way to keep the pulse there. Percent assessed per policy. So of your critical service providers, how many of them are we assessing per frequency? And then as an efficiency measure, of those findings that come out of that, how many of them are overdue? So again, it's similar as what we're looking at for scanner-based phones. It's just a governance function. Are we making sure that things get cleaned up, they're not laying around? Now on the employee side, it's very difficult to have a target and a measurement for awareness. So the approach that I really like is just to identify duplicates and trends. Right? Everybody's going to get spammed, everybody's going to click on something, maybe do some tailgating, but what you want to capture is when those things happen in clumps. And nothing invigorates a user awareness education program than real data. Hey, population, we saw this thing occur this many of times. It just makes it real for them. And then tearing out a page from DevOps, number of emergency or unplanned changes, percentage changes with a regression. This definitely requires taking out your change manager for a few pints, because this is an area that you probably won't have this data. You need to get access to that data, so by hook or by crook. And again, we didn't have time to generate visuals for all of these, but it's a waste of time if you don't negotiate that target and track against it. All right, so we're on to the third phase. That's the run. That's what the rabbit tells us. And once you have a minimum of 6, preferably 12 months of data, go back to those folks where you negotiate that target and challenge it. If was it too low and you had an incident, that's pretty instant feedback. But if it's too high, or is it too high, and how much costs were associated with that? And challenge all your assertions, and then you can do exercises like this. So take our server patching. What if we went from 98 to 80? What does that mean to the business? And people are actually doing this today. I'm helping somebody do this. So it's not pie in the sky, but it really is the conclusion of this data-driven security process. So here's the question. Now let's look at the process of driving this answer. And it's just 101 cost-benefit analysis. And one of the keys to success when you go through this exercise is choose a metric that has a variable cost associated with it. So patching is a really good one. So we can say, hey, how many people and how long does it take to go through test and deploy cycle after Patch Tuesday? Or Oracle 90 or whatever it is. And so say it takes 10 folks 5 days to do this. We can get a nice rough estimate. And what would it mean to the business if we took out 2 or 3 of these cycles for the year? That might be interesting from a cost perspective. So here's our benefit side. Now is where we have to use all that evidence that I've just been up here preaching about and use it to construct a story. So what does our history tell us from an incident perspective and our peer groups? What's the performance on our detect and response area that's going to contribute? And any type of intelligence that we have as far as how often are these attacks going to occur? Are there specific agents that we need to be worried about based off this control? So your evidence has to tell the story, not your opinion. But how you communicate that story, this is risk, right? So here we have 2 different ways where we can communicate this risk story. And I don't want to go into, I'd love to, but we don't have time, each of these different risk models. But the point is, your evidence tells the story. You need to choose the right communication mechanism that resonates with your leadership. If your management wants to communicate the delta in risk with a probability distribution saying, hey, if we lower our patch threshold, here's the increase in attack frequency that we're going to see. So on the left there, 90% of the occurrences, we're going to have a $13,000 event, and now we're moving to a $20,000 event. Some folks like that story. And on the right there, we could say, lowering this patch threshold is going to increase our frequency. Here we have user-defined ordinal buckets. We're going to go from the 0.3 occurrence bucket to the 0.5 occurrence bucket. Hey, if something's going to happen once every 3 years, maybe it's going to happen once every 2 years. So the communication mechanism is not as important as the evidence that supports it is really the takeaway. And this is really the culmination of that MoneySec effort that Brian started. He said, we start out with these tiny little metrics over here and understanding information, and what we end up with is an evidence-driven risk story. So I think that's very cool.
So one of the lessons, just kind of wrapping up here, one of the lessons that I learned from going out and trying to implement a more metrics-driven program in my environment was that our incident response really had to improve. I mentioned earlier that our incident response basically consisted of reformatting the machine, and then we just didn't get any information from that. And so what I'm proposing here is that incident response really needs to be moved out of IT. It shouldn't be an IT function, or if it is an IT function, then there should be a dedicated team or dedicated person in IT that's performing this. You need to make sure that you're collecting all the relevant data, because any virus infections are an incident. Gone are the days when you could map out, oh, well, here are the holes in my firewall, and here are the servers in my DMZ, and we'll just monitor everything in the DMZ, and when the attacker attacks, it's going to be a buffer overflow, and we'll see that. No, basically the way a lot of attackers are getting in now is through the desktop clients and through phishing and drive-by downloads, things like that. So your desktops are actually the front line in a lot of this. So if you get infections on your desktops, then you need to be treating those as incidents and investigating them. And you need this data in order to evaluate your controls, because if you're seeing that most of your incidents are on end-user systems or workstations, then you need to be collecting all the information related to those incidents and trying to do a root cause analysis to figure out what the cause of that infection was, so that you can see if it was a failed control or a non-existent control, or the control wasn't operating at its target. And that's going to guide your future controls and setting targets in the future. So this actually, and Brett Harden had something fairly similar to this yesterday, saying basically the same things, of we need to use the data to support our decisions, and this means going and looking at incidents and figuring out, okay, in this case, when we do the root cause analysis, was there a related metric here? Was there something that we were tracking that was related to the cause of this? And if we were, then was the target appropriate? So maybe we got hit by a client-side 0-day, and our target is that we'll be susceptible to a client-side 0-day once every 3 months. And it turns out this was the first time that happened in 5 months. So in that case, the target seems like it was appropriate, and we're operating pretty much as expected, or better than expected in this case. And there you go. That was the risk happened. That was the risk that we accepted. If there wasn't a related metric, then is this a total black swan event, or is this something that there was information that we really should have been tracking, and we kind of see similar things keep happening, and that's information that we should be collecting and defining a target for. And then, we just use that to find leading indicators of types of attacks and try to drive our controls with that.
Anybody do this today? Sorry, I was...
I could go through a whole rant on incident response, believe me. What's that?
I know, I was just playing Catholic Mother.
Shame on you. So a couple of parting thoughts here. One of those is that people are implicitly deciding all the time what not to measure. So, show of hands, how many people have had a project that they're working on, and they're like, oh, well, I could do this other little bit that we collect a little bit of information, or I could rush off and start this other project because my managed business objective is how many projects I finish this year, right? Like, everybody's done that. Everybody has said, oh, well, it'd be nice if I had time to, but I got to go start this other project. But you're making an implicit decision there that you're not going to collect that information that's available, and you're not going to completely implement that control. And what you're doing without realizing it is saying that it's more valuable to complete a lot of projects than it is to complete them well or have thorough coverage. So just make sure that you're cognizant of that trade-off that you're making, and make an explicit decision of, okay, no, we're not going to 100% finish this project because there's this other project that we need to start, and it's related to this project, this program, and the risk manager for this has decided that they have a very low tolerance for risk, so we need to solve that one first, et cetera, et cetera. But make data-driven decisions on that.
Yeah, it really is hard not to sound like Catholic Mother up here. But that's the whole purpose of starting with data that's easy to get. And the Volm Scan is my favorite.
So we're actually ripping through this really fast. I could go
Speaking
back
of-
and do a whole rant on incident response.
Yeah, speaking of Catholic Mother, now we have Protestants.
So actually, this was really great timing. This was last week. There was a blog post on liquid matrix, and it was actually talking about very much the same topic of the stuff that we're doing right now isn't working, and what would a real solution look like? What should we be doing to try to make a dent in this problem? And to me, it just reminded me, especially because of the sheer quantity of candidate metrics that were suggested in that blog post, it reminded me of Martin Luther and the Reformation, right? We're just tacking something up to the door here and saying, what you guys have been doing so far isn't working. It's not serving anyone's interest except your own. It's not helping the general populace. And here are some things that I think that we should be doing that would really help. So you should, by all means, this isn't meant to be readable, you should go read this Liquid Matrix blog post. I think it was by Iron Fog, Ben, I forget his last name, I'm sorry. And read through that whole post. And really, the meat of it is at the end of the things that he recommended that you start tracking within your environment.
How many folks have read that? Nice.
Yes, that's awesome.
So does somebody mind sharing, what did you think of the ending? What's that?
It's better than the beginning.
Hell
Yeah.
yes.
Absolutely.
Thank goodness I survived the beginning of that article. But did it inspire you to do anything?
So is there anybody that's actually tracking any of these, even if you haven't set a target for you, actually tracking any of these statistics that were mentioned? Yeah, a couple people, so there's like
Nice.
3 or so. Okay, so progress.
Excellent. Cool.
So that's a
Do
good
you
segue, actually. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Do you want to? And we've got a couple more anecdotes, but it's really just expanding on some of our previous topics. We wanted to pause here and see if folks want to share. Hey, just as we have our favorite metrics, where it's fairly easy to get the information and to drive what an acceptable target is. Now's the opportunity. We're on camera. Somebody can show off if there's a metric that you like or a war story that you want to share. I saw some hands go up after that liquid matrix question.
Yeah, in particular, is there anything that you've noticed when you're collecting data where you've then made a change to a control somewhere and all of a sudden you see a different output in your data, that you're getting different results, different outcomes? Nope. Right. Yeah, so the comment was that there was a case where you're collecting information, right, and you were able to show that one of the controls that was implemented was costing a lot, and it wasn't necessarily giving a huge return for the cost, so they could justify ratcheting that back.
Cool. Can you give one more layer of specifics?
We were looking at data exfiltration and infiltration. In the flow of it, and there was perception. There was a lot we didn't know. And
Right.
it's true, we didn't know what it was we didn't know, so we said, all right, let's get at least a basis that we can measure and identify,
Right.
which was a smart way to start. Instead of being, oh, we're going to block it, that was the original plan. We said, no, let's find out first. When found out what was going in and out, assuming the pattern, didn't assume the one anomaly stuff, we got that. As a pattern, after we were done measuring it, we found the pattern was extremely small and not justify much larger expenses. We significantly traction down the next expenditure. And we got some small risk there, we said it deserved a small spend.
Awesome. You want
So-
to summarize that?
Yeah, so the summary on that was basically, it sounds like, and I'll just paraphrase here, there was a DLP project, and they were afraid that there was a lot of data being exfiltrated, and so they decided to implement some controls and measure that and see how much data actually was being exfiltrated. And then when they actually looked at the hard numbers after running it for a period of time, they discovered there really wasn't much data being exfiltrated, and so that they didn't need to make a huge investment in trying to solve that problem. They could deal with that risk in other ways.
And you get the checkbox, so that's a DLP win-win.
Wait.
Have you heard of metrics that are more along the lines of impacting the organization? Say, if you give people a chance to opt into a screen timeout that's short, medium, or long, and seeing if you can improve that, get more people to the short one, for instance.
So basically, so if I can summarize, testing if the security controls are optional, seeing how many people, or the levels of the security controls are optional, seeing how many people will elect for the more stringent security controls voluntarily.
That would be fun. I've never heard of that. But wouldn't it be fun to toy with them that way?
It's like a Stanford experiment or something.
Do you know of any?
That's a small example, but we've got a culture of different kinds of people in the organization. We couldn't come up with a one-size-fits-all, so we did this kind of opt-in.
Okay.
Interesting. Yeah.
Come on, one more before we.
Really general statement, but we're using one control to look at another control, both of which are very critical. And one of them is actually proving that the other control, which is very, very expensive, is more or less useless. It isn't actually doing what it's supposed to do, which a very large company that happens to be next to ours.
So basically, if I can summarize there, basically you have two controls. One's kind of watching the watcher, and you're monitoring the output from that, and you're determining that, well, the second control really isn't performing at a rate that justifies the expense.
Yeah, and also
Love it.
doesn't justify the additional time to maybe the recommendations to upgrade to the newest version that will solve all our issues.
Yep.
We're going to test.
Right. Yeah. So that's great data. Yeah. So do you want to hit really quickly on the coverage from the DBIR?
I will. So, at the risk of belaboring the point, we've got more process anecdotes, but we thought it'd be interesting to say, hey, when you selected your MoneySec metrics, how do those overlay to the top threat actions from the Verizon DBIR? So I'm sure you've all have these tattooed somewhere. So we just took our high-level metrics for vulnerability scanner output. And at the risk of oversimplifying again, just areas where monitoring is going to assist. I mean, throw in some application security there, and you pretty much have covered the top 16 threat actions, which I believe were 86%, of the records, or I believe it was records, throughout the study. So again, our goal was to find what is the smallest amount of metrics with the easiest to collect data that directly related to incidents. And I think this visual really shows, hey, even though the Verizon report is really point of sale heavy, driving improvement in those areas is going to lead to a reduction of incidents.
Yep.
Now we just need to prove it.
So no pressure, guys. So actually, we made much better time than we expected. So thank you all for sitting through what could have possibly been a very boring academic subject on metrics. Hopefully we made it interesting, and more hopefully motivated you guys to go out and start collecting some of this information and setting targets for where you should be performing at. So this is our contact information, and feel free to follow us on Twitter or get in touch with us after the talk.